Hi everyone. Our reading today comes from Matthew's 14th chapter, verses 13 through 21. Now when Jesus heard about the beheading of John the Baptist, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away, so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. And taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven. And he blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. The Gospel of the Lord. An elderly couple passed away and found themselves being given a tour of heaven by St. Peter. St. Peter said, "Here's the oceanside condo. Over there are the tennis courts, the swimming pool, and 2 golf courses. If you need any refreshments, just stop by any of the many bars located throughout the area." After St. Peter walked off, the old man hissed to his wife, "Heck, Gloria, we could have been here 10 years ago if you hadn't heard about all that stupid oat bran, wheat germ, and low-fat diet." Both of our readings today are about food. Free food, actually, and in my family, that's always a good thing. The 4 Gospels, as we know them, today include many of the same stories about Jesus, and they're often told in the same order. But strangely, there are only 2 stories that are told in all 4 Gospels. The first is the account of Jesus' resurrection, and the second is our Gospel reading for today. And I'd like to spend a moment to give you an idea of what is going on in the background, right before Jesus miraculously feeds thousands of people. Jesus had just visited his hometown of Nazareth, and the people there basically thought he was genuinely crazy. Nazareth was not a prominent city back then. There were reported to be less than 2,000 people who lived there. When Jesus was there, it was not a big city either. Like many small towns, the people of Nazareth knew Jesus when he was a little boy. They watched him grow up. They watched him play with his friends in the streets. They watched him eventually become a carpenter. And now he's claiming that he is God. The same people who knew Jesus for so many years got so upset with him that they ran him out of town. They took him to the edge of a cliff to throw him off. They had had enough of him at this point. Around that same time, Jesus received news that his friend and his cousin, John the Baptist, had been brutally killed by King Herod. Murdered, actually. And Herod was hoping to get Jesus next. This was not a good time in the life of Jesus. He needed some time away from the crowds. He needed some time away from all this chaos and the people who were trying their darndest to kill him. And so Jesus and his 12 closest followers step into a boat and go out into the Sea of Galilee to a deserted place to find some rest and to regroup. Now keep in mind that Jesus is incredibly popular at this point. He has performed many miracles. He has taught in ways that no one has ever heard before. Word has gotten around that Jesus has slipped away into a boat, and so masses of people are trying to find him. They are following him. Imagine how Jesus could have reacted when he saw these hordes of people waiting for him on the shore. We know he is exhausted, and we know he is grieving the loss of his cousin. And all he probably wants is a little time to regroup and recharge. But instead of redirecting the course of his boat, instead of getting irritated, we're told that Jesus saw the crowds, was overcome with pity, and he healed the sick. And after a few hours of this, the disciples came to Jesus and basically said, "All right, Jesus, let's just call it a day. We're all tired. We are way out here in the middle of nowhere, and the people are all getting hungry. You need to tell everyone to leave so that they can go and get some food for themselves." Now, something you need to keep in mind here is that even though this story is called the feeding of the 5,000, there are likely twice as many people here. The ancient Jewish culture was patriarchal. They only counted the men. If you were to factor in women and children in the crowd, it could easily have been 10,000 or possibly more. So when Jesus tells the disciples to give all of these people dinner, you can imagine their response. "Really, Jesus? How are we supposed to do that? We barely have any food on hand, and the villages around here probably don't even have enough for these people. It's not like we can go down to the grocery store and get a load of hot dogs and Doritos and Coke for 10,000 people." But Jesus says, "Look, guys, just obey me." Keep in mind here that the disciples had seen Jesus performing lots and lots of miracles, healings, casting out of demons. I mean, some pretty intense stuff. But somehow the miracle of providing food was clearly not on their radar. And this is where things started to get really interesting. Let's take a look at verse 18. Jesus says, "Bring the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish to me." And then he had everyone sit down on the grass, and he took the food and he lifted his face to heaven in prayer. Then he blessed and he broke and he gave the food to his disciples, and then he had them give it to the people. And the people ate until they were full, and there was food left over. And each disciple now at the end of this has their own basket left. Something to share with someone else. Now this is God's economic program. You take what you've been given and you share it with others. This reading reminds us of the kind of God that we serve. It's pretty easy to think that God just belongs in our church building, or we just turn to God only in these desperate times when there are emergencies. But Jesus' actions here show us that God cares about every aspect of our lives. The reality then and now is that God is in the business of working miracles. Not just in a church. Now let's make this personal for a minute, because some of you here listening are going through something in your life and you're feeling completely powerless. There's stuff going on in your life right now and you're saying, "I don't have the wisdom. That situation is beyond me. I don't have the strength to get through it. I don't have much hope." It is so easy to get stuck in our common sense line of thinking. And the disciples saw people needed food and basically said, "Sorry, no can do. Go and find your own food. The disciples were so caught up in their old ways of thinking that they didn't even consider what God could do. How often are we the exact same way? We don't even pause to consider how God can work in our everyday lives. I'm guessing so many of us can relate to this. To focusing on the difficulties in our lives, these unsolvable situations, to illness, to difficult people, to financial worries, and all of a sudden we just push God into the background. We get sick and we don't even stop to pray. We run into money troubles and we go right out to get advice, which is a good thing to do, but it doesn't occur to us to pray. We have issues with our family and we don't think to bring God into those problems. We have a major decision and we create lists of pros and cons and we agonize over the outcome, and yet we never consider to bring God into the decision. But then Jesus takes action. He knows he can take the inadequate, and through his power, he can make it more than enough. Author Greg Boyd once put it this way: we stick to our own resources instead of turning to God's unlimited resources. We realize we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish. But it's not about what we can do. It's about what God can do. I'd like to challenge you to break out of that line of thinking that God is only there in that church part of your life. I want to encourage you to stop barricading God from the real life stuff that you're going through, and instead invite him in to everyday living. In the book of Isaiah, God says, I hold the universe in the span of my hand. It fits right there. This God who holds the universe that we live in, this is the God that we come to worship, to sing to, and to pray to. And remembering this perspective can dramatically shift our own way of thinking, our own levels of anxiety, the ways that we go about our everyday lives. Maybe we feel inadequate, like we don't have very much we can offer. But our gospel reading for today shows us that God delights in using the powerless and the weak and the forgotten and the outsider and the little and the overlooked and the insignificant and the insufficient to accomplish God's mission. As I've reflected on this week's reading, I was really struck by how Jesus steps into this story in such a discouraging place. Probably a feeling that many of us can relate to with what's been going on around us over the last few months. And yet, in the midst of what seems to be darkness, Jesus turns directly to God in prayer. And suddenly the mundane becomes miraculous. Do you see, this is a lesson for our time and our place. This week, I really encourage you to worry less and pray more. If you're worrying, stop and bring it to God in prayer. Try it. Pray more. If there is one thing we can learn from our gospel reading today, it is that God can do a lot with so little. Jesus takes the insufficient, and through his power, he makes it sufficient. Please pray with me. God, we thank you for this reminder that we are not alone. We are never alone. And we thank you again, God, that you have created this incredible world in which we live, and you have not left us in darkness. Your light has come through the person of Jesus, through his teachings, through his life, through his miracles. God, we do ask for those miracles in our own lives and the many different struggles that we face. May you continue to bring hope and life. Remind us that our everyday problems are nothing compared to you. You are more than sufficient. Help us, God. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.